Great. Well, welcome to this session. Today we're going to talk about the art of writing up an extension article and how to make your results relevant to your extension audience. And Javier, Fernandez, Salvador, and I are going to tag team this session. And so you'll get a couple of perspectives, which I think always helps when you're in your writing. So to dive right into it, this first one is, many of us have experience and have worked at writing scientific articles. And when we're writing for a scientific audience, we know who that audience is, our colleagues, and we all know the same jargon because the people that are reading our papers are people that are interested in that same area. However, when we're writing an extension article, we don't necessarily know exactly who that audience might be. It could be a beginning grower. It could be somebody that's not from the United States and is reading our materials. It could be somebody that's a gardener and just learning things. So we really want to keep things simple. And a nice way to think about that, the picture at the top right-hand corner is my grandmother and my son. And I always think when I'm writing extension articles, okay, would my grandmother understand this? Or would my mom understand this? Or even would my son understand this? Because in extension, they often talk about writing at a 5th grade level, so anyone can access your material. So it's really a different way of thinking from what we're used to in scientific writing, but it's really a good thing to think about when you're starting to write your extension article. When I was preparing this talk, I found these 7 C's of writing, which I think are really useful, and they were created by Don Randley, who's a professor at the University of Missouri in the School of Journalism. And he really gives you good guidelines for checking the effectiveness of your writing. So we're going to go through these. The first one, and probably one of the most important ones, is you want to be correct. And that means the information that you're giving to people, as well as every detail in that extension publication that you're writing. So first, make sure everything you're writing is accurate and your credibility is at stake, but also any other author whose name is on this publication's credibility is also at stake. And we really want to check everything you put in there, including your names, dates, phone numbers. And in this day and age, URLs are really important to have right. And they're really easy to screw up because some of them, especially things like YouTube videos, which is there in that first example, have all those different letters and numbers, and it's really easy to leave one off and not get it exactly right. So it's really important to go back and check every URL that you're going to have in your publication and to check them fairly often. URLs are notorious for changing, and if you have an extension article and then you don't look at it for a year or two and half the URLs in your article no longer work, that really affects people using that article and getting the most out of it. And that's why after these URLs, we have things like when it was last accessed, so people can tell if it's something you've done recently or if it's from 2010 and you haven't really looked at it since. The next one is to be consistent. You want to make sure that everything looks and reads like it belongs together. Sometimes when you're doing articles, you have more than one author and you divide sections. But even if you're doing that, it's very important to go back through and make sure it all reads in one cohesive voice. Other things you want to pay particular attention to the way you're using are things like numbers and figures. So are you going to write out the numbers or use the numerical form? And the general rule of thumb, and your university might have some rules themselves on this, so it's always good to check with your marketing and communications department. The general rule of thumb is if the number is less than 10, you would write out the word, and if it's 10 or more, you use the actual number. But again, that can vary from place to place. Then things like titles, be consistent. If you're mentioning a person's title, that you do it for everybody that you use or don't do it for anybody. And then you want to make sure that you're using names, authors and organization names the same, and abbreviations, and units is a big one for us. Again, if you're used to writing journal articles, oftentimes we use the metric system when we're writing journal articles. For extension publications, especially here in the United States, our clientele aren't necessarily used to the metric system, so we need to have it in English units and make sure we're not going back and forth between the two and keep it consistent. We can do English units and then have metric units in parentheses, and I think that's more and more common in extension articles, but we want to make sure that we're consistent so we're not switching back and forth and people are scratching their heads. Then other things you want to pay attention to are things like the headlines and other headings, and fonts and your taglines and your logos and your graphics, because that consistency really makes a difference when people are reading it, to have that polish on it. You want to make sure that you're clear, make everything easy to understand and find. Again, we're used to some technical terms or jargon for each of our fields, but the people reading our material aren't. And so we want to make sure that we're defining any terms that may not be readily known to our readers. And kind of going back to your audience a little bit, when we're talking about a grower audience, some growers are going to be beginning growers. Some growers are going to be very experienced growers that probably know more than we do on that topic. So you want to make sure that there's something in that article for everyone that's going to read it, not just at a beginner level and not too technical that beginners are going to be lost in it. But you don't want to assume that your readers know what you know. And so this is when it's really important to know who your main target audience is. But wherever possible, you want to use simple language, and you want to answer your readers' so what question. So just because something's clear to you, it doesn't mean it's going to be clear to them. And that's going to be their first question. What am I getting out of this? So you want to give them that take-home message. This is a good example about being clear and knowing who your audience is. So this is from a Hort Science publication that we did on fruit yield in pepper for one of our experiments. And for Hort Science, we have all of our yield data in tons per hectare of total fruit, marketable and unmarketable. And for the Hort Science audience, this is fine, but if I give this to a grower, it's not going to mean a lot to them besides just seeing differences in our mulch treatments, but they're going to be more curious as to how that yield broke down. And this is a different example in how we present variety trial data to growers. So these are bell pepper variety trials we did, but for a grower, they really want to see, okay, I know that I can sell the most boxes of large peppers. So they want to see it broken down into size classes and the number of boxes per acre rather than a total amount of tonnage, and especially a total amount of tonnage per hectare because they're used to acres. So that would throw them for a loop. So for example, if I want to have the most extra large fruit, then I'm going to look in that second size category there and see that Mercer was the one that produced the most extra large boxes per acre. If I want something, if I have a market that has a lot of jumbo fruit, then something like Aristotle would be my top pick. But generally for a grower, and again, it comes to knowing your audience, they often get paid by the number of fruit, or a store sells it by the number of fruit, not by the total weight. And so that's where the boxes become really important for a grower to know what's going on there. The next thing is to be concise. So again, we're used to writing our materials and methods for scientific papers and giving lots and lots of details. But for an extension publication, you want to give folks enough background that they understand what you did, but you don't need to give them all those nitty-gritty details. So we also want to use active voice instead of passive voice. We want to use short sentences, and we don't want to save the best for last. We want that most important information near the top of our page or our publication. And if you're doing any sort of electronic media, you want to make sure that you avoid slow loading graphics. And that can be really important for our clientele in rural areas that might not have as good internet connection as people in a metro area. The next C is to be coherent. And if there's anything you think people don't understand that is not pertinent to your message, that's when it's time to throw it out. If you're kind of getting off in the weeds, you can really trim it down and get back to your main message. So again, you want to use easy to understand language, not flowery words. And it's good to draw in simple comparisons so your readers can really visualize things that they're not familiar with. And I think I have a couple examples of that. Oh, they must be coming up. The next one is to be complete. So include everything that you need so people aren't emailing you and asking you for details that you should have had in there. Make sure you provide examples that illustrate those points. And then we want to pay attention to the 5 W's and the H. And Javier is going to talk more about this in a little bit. But you want to tell the readers who did the work and who it affects and what. So the event or information or news is clear. When. So when did you do a particular study? Was it last season or was it 10 years ago? Where did you do it? So things that are important. If you have growers in a very long or wide state, is it going to be relevant to people all across the state, or are people, for example, in Tennessee, West Tennessee is much different than East Tennessee for us. So West Tennessee is very dry and hotter than it is in the hills of East Tennessee. So information on vegetable production in East Tennessee is not necessarily as relevant to West Tennessee as if we do something right out there in West Tennessee. So that where really becomes important. Then the why. So informing your readers of the purpose behind the information. Why did you look at 10 different varieties or different treatments that you used? And then the how, to give the readers the sense of what you did behind that story. The next one is to be creative, and we're used to seeing extension publications in pretty similar form, so a couple of pictures here and there and lots of words, but you want to make sure that your writing is interesting, but it's going to focus on content, and you want to look for new information to present. And Alex really talked about this last session, which was really good. You don't want to write another publication on the same topic that someone else has done just because you might be in a different location than they are. If the information's the same, it's the same whether I'm in Tennessee or Kentucky. And you really want to make sure that you're really combing that literature and coming up with something unique that people can use. And this is really true in the age of the internet, where we all have access to information from all over the world. And lastly, you want to look for new ways to present information. So here is a poster that we did for a food safety project that we have. And for food safety, it's not a very exciting topic and people don't get really into food safety. So we're always trying to think of new ways to get the message across and keep the basic ideas of food safety in folks' head. And so we made these posters that they could hang up in their packing shed or on their farm somewhere, and would just give them good visual cues as they go throughout their day and little snippets. So not flooding them with a lot of words, but just those visual cues and nice colorful graphics. So just thinking about ways where you can repackage things in different ways to make it more appealing to the audience can be really helpful as well. Then they always say that a picture is worth 1,000 words, and that can be true of a table or a figure as well. But this is a good example of that. So what you can see in the foreground here are tomato plants in a high tunnel, and in the back is the same variety of tomato plants, but this grower added on to his high tunnel this year. And so he didn't know what was going on in the tunnel because he has the exact same variety, and the plants in the back, the new area under the high tunnel, had plants that were twice as high as the ones in the front. And what had happened over time of him growing in this tunnel is he was getting salt buildup in the tunnel and didn't even realize it because everything was under the same conditions. When he added this new section of the tunnel, then it was very obvious that something was going on in the older part of the tunnel where he'd been growing for several years. And when they went back and did a soil test, they found that that older part of the tunnel where they'd been growing and growing and growing and there's no rain to leach out those nutrients had 700 pounds of sodium per acre, while that new area in the back only had 50 to 80 pounds of sodium per acre. So they were really having a salinity problem. And this is a big issue in high tunnel production, But this is a wonderful illustration because you can talk about salinity issues, but when you see it and it's this drastic, it really makes an impression on people. This is another food safety example. In Food Safety Now and in the Food Safety Modernization Act, we talk about zones of produce, of how you should prioritize your cleaning and sanitation. And this is a concept that's really foreign to produce growers. And so this is a good way to illustrate it. So zone 1 are going to be things that come in direct contact with the produce. And you can see here that these melons are on a sorting table and they're directly touching that sorting table surface. So that's a zone 1, and we want to be really cognizant of cleaning and sanitizing that surface so those cantaloupes aren't getting contaminated and spreading that contamination from one fruit to the next. The next zone is things that are directly adjacent to a food contact surface, or that belt or table that we see there. So it's things like the outside surface of that washer right next to that zone 1 surface. Then the zone 3 are going to be things that are even farther removed. So things like the walls and the floor in this packing area. And then zone 4 is going to be the furthest removed, and that's going to be outside of the packing house. But things we still want to be cognizant of are taking care of the weeds around the packing house and making sure that we have wildlife rodent control all around that packing house that we're taking care of from a food safety standpoint. And this is just an example of a table. This is storage compatibility for various fruits and vegetables, and it's broken down into 4 groups to kind of make it easier for people to decide how to store things, what humidity things are stored at, and what temperature. And so in the first group are things that berries and cherries and things, and they're going to be at 32 degrees. And then we have things in group 3, like the garlic and the onions and the shallots, and they're going to have less humidity than those other things. So we want lower humidity in those. And then group 4 is going to be the chilling sensitive things that if we stored them at 32, we would get chilling damage on those. And the group 2, the difference between group 1 and group 2 are ethylene producers versus non-ethylene producers. So the rutabagas and the turnips kind of go in both categories, but a lot of the rest of these we're going to keep them away from these things in the top category because they would cause ethylene damage. So I think this is my last slide, and then I'll turn it over to Javier. But there's 2 reasons that after you finish a publication, you want to make sure that you proofread it twice and that you have other people proofread it for you with fresh eyes who haven't seen it before. Because often, even when we proofread, we're so used to seeing things and knowing what we want to say that we kind of skip over it. It's kind of like those things you see when they leave vowels out of words and you can still tell what the word is. It's the same thing with our own writing. When we know what we think we're saying, we kind of gloss over it instead of really reading it critically. But the first time you proofread, you want to check for what you have written, and the second time you want to check for how you've written. So all those things, you want to check the factualness of the information you presented. You want to make sure it's all cohesive, and you want to make sure that every detail is picture perfect. So to close my part of this with the words from Don Ranley, write unto others as you would have them write unto you. And a good way to get started on writing an extension article is to really read a few, because you can tell when you read, just like with a good scientific paper, you can tell when you read a nice, concise publication and what made it a good publication. And so find some examples to use when you're writing up your work, and it'll really help you out as you go forward. So that's all I have. And now we're going to turn it over to Javier.
Okay, Javier, you might want to unmute your mic there, and then I'm going to give you the remote control of the screen.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me well?
Yep.
Wonderful.
Okay, one
Okay.
second. Okay, so click on your screen once and then you should have control of the screen.
Okay, great. So I'm going to talk today about and give you a few examples. And I've been working with undergrads and graduate students a lot lately. And one of the parts that they don't cover in their training is how to work on extension publications. So this is some part, and a very important part of the mentoring that I do is to include all of these different things. And I wanted to get started with the covering actually the questions that Annette mentioned before, including in this case who, right? So this is a publication that we are actually revising right now on how to set up load tunnels for season extension in day neutral strawberries. So of course, you're going to include who was working in the project, right? What students, research assistants, etc., who are the authors that put field work and also have contributed to the publication, but as well include who basically what is it that you're focusing on covering, in this case day neutral strawberries, right? Then what when we're a very important part here is to explain what is that low tunnel is. There are not a lot of people that are completely familiar with how a low tunnel operates. This is not something that is used in the West Coast at all. But with climate change, we've noticed that a lot of growers are very interested in it because of the different rain events and also double benefit that you can get from this low tunnel. So to get them started, and if they're interested in adopting these practices, it's good to cover what an actual low tunnel is. Then when, this could be referred to many different things, but in the case of this publication, we are looking at season extension, right? When can these low tunnels be used, and what all of these different terms that I'm going to be talking about today refer to different parts, and they are all interconnected, as you will note as we go through these examples. But yeah, season extension. When we have increased temperature, there's benefits for it because the plastic might block UV radiation. When we have rain events, it will definitely be a great advantage because it will block the rain that will be falling directly on your fruit and your leaves, which can also contribute to diseases and problems with rot in the fruit. Then why? So this is something that is, I think, the part that you really want to focus on is what are the possible benefits and why are we doing this, right? And this is a great example for Oregon because people have not used low tunnels here much. The high tunnels are used for season extension in the spring and fall when it starts to get cold. But I've always wondered, why is it that we're not using low tunnels? The cost is less, the management is not that much more complicated. So explaining and putting those things in the reasons that you're giving in your publication is very important. Then you also have the part about how. So explain, in the case of if you're presenting results from a trial that you did, you're going to basically cover your materials and methods and how you did it. But when you transport it, when you change it to an extension publication, you want to be able to explain it in terms that are very accessible and understandable to growers, so that they can really see the benefits that they could do right away and how to, in this case, prepare a low-cost tunnel for use at their farm. And then, I'm just going to move this out of the way. Ooh, it is not working. Okay. And then, sorry about that. Another thing that I wanted to mention here is, and this was brought up to me later when we were actually, this is one of the reasons why we're reviewing this. It's because and I wanted to point it out at you, when you take a picture, and yes, a picture says a lot more than words sometimes, right? As Annette had mentioned before. But you really want to be sure to caption everything in the picture so that the grower or the person reading that extension publication can know exactly what they're looking at. Okay, so in this case, if you look at the supplies in G and H are all of the different types of stakes that we used, and also between the bungee cords and twine that we used to tie all of these low tunnels. What was suggested to me afterwards was maybe you want to contrast that they don't have to have all of these different types of materials, but that you are actually giving them options. And I thought it was clear, but I think we can revise it to be more specific on what are the different options that you can use, and put the different ways that those tunnels were in the field. So that is something that is important for you to remember, that when you put a picture, when you put a photo, try to explain it and point out what it is that you're doing over there. Same as with what we see with the anchor there. I was also suggested that if you're going to put a message on what the anchoring system is for the tunnel, try to put an arrow or something that points at it in the picture so that people know exactly what you're referring to. Now, for this example, this is another publication that we just updated, hasn't been updated in about 18 years. So we did multiple reviews and work on getting the latest information that we have here. But I wanted to mention that this has to be clear for all audiences. Don't assume that your audience knows exactly what a June bearing or a day neutral cultivar are. So I work a lot with beginner farmers and small farmers that don't necessarily understand the differences between a June bearing cultivar and a day neutral cultivar. So that is something that we actually revised and covered in the beginning of the publication. But it's also very important that you review all of the terms that you're using, so that for a farmer, a strawberry might be a strawberry, especially if you're new to it. But the two systems are completely different. As well as using simple things like abbreviations. In this table, you can see, I mean, for me, that I work with all of these different nutrients most of the time for fertility studies, it's completely apparent what the abbreviations are. But a grower might not know that, for example, potassium is abbreviated with a K. So that's something that you really want to be able to have those basic tables to show that, as well as the unit of measurements that Annette had mentioned before. Using the two systems, the international and also the British system or American system for putting your units is more and more common, and I think that's something that you should cover for the papers that you're going to submit for the competition. And then, of course, all of the credit to other people. If you are doing a good lit review and basing your paper on the work that others have done, be sure to avoid any type of plagiarism and give credit and other contact information for the people that have worked on those projects before. And then, again, this is something that I really want to mention too, is proofread and have multiple reviewers of your publication. So not only an audience that is completely familiar with what you're writing, but in this case, we submitted the publication to a couple of organic growers that have never produced strawberries. And they had quite a bit of very interesting comments that we were able to incorporate afterwards. Or, for example, if you're doing publication that is for organic growers versus conventional growers, that's a really, really good example, because sometimes the organic growers are not familiar with certain pesticides names, as well as the conventional growers might not be familiar with other practices that organic growers might use. Another thing, this is another publication that we're working on, which is preparing guides for fruit quality and sorting in the field for strawberries. And what I wanted to mention here is that you always need to be inclusive and think about all of the audiences that you're going to reach. So for example, in this case, this was pointed out to me that some of the people were having a hard time looking at the colors because one of the person was colorblind. So you have to, the nice thing right now in the United States is that the majority of universities try to have programs that will do this kind of review for accessibility of documents for you when you're working on a publication, but it's always something that you should consider. Try to think about how would this look in black and white, for example. What other options can I work on these to make it more accessible to the different audiences that are out there, as well as languages. One of the issues that we run into at OSU is that sometimes the publication would just be translated into Spanish, as an example, but not necessarily considering that the translator might not be in complete familiarity with agricultural terms, or with the immigrant population in the state that might be, for example, of Mexican origin. The Spanish that you can find in different parts of Latin America varies widely. So it's very important to have all of these considerations for you when you're preparing an extension article. Now, I wanted to also cover, I added all of these to the presentation that we did at ASHS last time, because I've been working with the students and they have mentioned a few things that we should focus on. So this is something that I wanted to cover. And the first thing is, it's particularly important for you to give a reason on why you are conducting a research, the research that you're doing for extension. So I'm going to cover a couple of things on survey data for that we have done and how we've presented surveys. And some of the participants today I've been working with, and they have actually worked with communities of farmers on their projects, and they're trying to do a connection on what are the barriers that you can have between scientific studies and how that translates into grower adoption. So yeah, a needs assessment is very important, and try to cover it before. And of course, the budget might not permit for that all the time, but it's at least try to get some background and information on why you are conducting this study. For an extension publication is particularly important. And then in this case, we did in-person interviews. There's online surveys that you could do, focus groups, and even documented informal meeting information documented from informal meetings with growers. In the United States, we have commissions for different products for different crops. So it's easy to reach out to them, and they have representatives from the growers that can give you information on what to focus on and what research they're interested in. As with other types of studies, base your questions and the results that you're going to present on your project objectives. I'm going to give you a few examples of project objectives today. And I also wanted to mention something that I have been getting repeated questions from undergrads and grad students. When they're describing their results, it's very important not to describe the results the same way that you are basically putting it on the table. And I will go into that and into a couple examples for that. As well as using adequate figures for the type of data presented. So let's start with this one. One of the projects that we're working on right now is working with small growers that are trying to establish olive orchards in Oregon. And since we have a much colder weather than, let's say, California, or where it's a truly Mediterranean climate, the growers are interested in seeing how we can get these orchards established or improve the ways that we can help the plants survive these cold winters. So the first step before we decided on the priorities was to ask them what are their main production issues, right? So as you can see here, of course, winter injury is one of them, fruit set, which is also kind of related to winter injury. And then there's other multiple things. So when you're writing, state why your research is important and what population it serves and the limitations it has. So for example, here you have clearly winter cold injury is a main concern for growers in our region, right? And when we cite the survey that we did with them, as well as olive growers of all sizes had issues with orchard establishment, right? And then when interviewed, multiple other issues were mentioned by growers in our study, and our study focuses on, right? So give the appropriate background in your introduction so that the people and the person reading that publication can see why it's done and the different things that you are going to be covering specifically. Now, let's go right into the objectives part. This is a figure of the main cultivars that are grown here currently in the state. And there were these 4 cultivars. The one that end in an O are Tuscan varieties from Italy, from the northern part of Italy, while Arbequina is a Spanish cultivar, right? So we want to be sure that they're, one of the concerns is, well, we're growing all these cultivars, how cold sensitive are those? So I'm going to give you 2 examples of the objectives. The first one is for the survey that we did, right? So we want to be concise, and in this case, the objective of the survey is to determine the olive grower extension programming and research needs, right? And then the most relevant challenges to the industry in Oregon. So you specifically go into the things that you are going to be asking in that survey, okay? And what is the scope? I wanted to really focus on giving you the scope that will be covered by the project that you're doing. The next objective below, the other example, is actually an outcome of the survey, and is based on the field research that we're going to be doing. So the objective of the other project, right, is to determine field cold hardiness based on winter tissue injury for the most commonly planted olive cultivars at multiple grower collaborator sites. So you limit it to, we started with, when we were defining the project, we had multiple ideas and growers gave all sorts of things to focus on, as you saw in the previous slide, but we really want to focus on the cold hardiness based on winter injury. So be very specific on what to put, include the area and the population that you will be serving. And in this case, also, this research will be entirely based at grower collaborator sites. So it's very important to point that out. Use the right chart for your data. This is something that I was mentioning before. When we originally started working on this analysis with the students, they would tend to put all of them in pie charts. So if you can imagine, if you have all of these many cultivars put in a pie chart, it's much easier and also much more significant for someone that is reading the article to try to use the right chart for the type of data that you're putting. So here you can clearly see what the main cultivars are, and you don't also get rid of all of the additional information of all of the other cultivars grown here. Okay, and then in your paper also be sure this is coming from a PowerPoint presentation, so it doesn't have a caption, but in your paper you want to be sure that your figure is very well explained, that you have a title that encompasses what you're covering, and then also that you have footnotes that explain different things. So one good example here is, for example, where you see that a lot of cultivars have a slash in between them, and multiple growers were telling us that a certain cultivar would have a name, and then they thought that they have a different cultivar, and we ended up finding out that they were just synonyms depending on the country they are grown. So explain that in your footnote, and that will be very clear to your audience. Okay. Then I also wanted to cover this other example when writing your results for an extension paper. Avoid describing the results that you're already presenting in a table or figure to reduce all of this redundancy. So for example, the question here is, what percentage of trees have you lost to winter cold damage, right? So in the figure, you can see that blue section of the pie where it says the 25% lost 75 to 100% of their trees, right? On the cold event. So if you were write it like that, you're basically repeating what you have in the chart with what you're writing in the article. So 25% of growers lost 75 to 100% of their tree. So basically, try to avoid that because that is already showing in the figure. If you look for a more adequate rate of writing and referencing the figure, the grower is going to be able to reach your figure and make their own way of looking at what you have there, if your figure is clear. So when you put a statement, a better statement would be most growers lost trees during cold injury, including a quarter of them having to possibly replace larger parts of their orchard after devastating freezing events. So then you reference the figure and you can also look at all of the other options. So for example, in this case, you'll see the loss of 0 to 25%, 50 to 75, etc. And then another thing that I wanted to mention, this is something that we already talked about before. The information is not wrong, but presenting it twice it's something that you want to avoid. And then here, this is something that we were talking with Annette when we were reviewing this PowerPoint. And I was looking at the other section. And the figure doesn't really tell me what other means. So be sure to define all of the terms that you use in figures on your footnotes. In this case, other specifically meant growers that were interviewed, but have not put trees in the ground yet. So there were quite a bit of growers that were keeping those trees and overwintering in them in greenhouses, for example, and they haven't put them in the field. So it's important for you to explain, otherwise it could be misinterpreted or misunderstood when you have the figure. Okay, I think I have covered the few examples that I wanted to give.